Hello and welcome to Science In and Out. I am Anouk.
And I am Marit, and this podcast is part of our course Nature of Scientific Discipline.
We are so happy you're listening in. In this podcast series, we'll be talking about a range of different topics. There's a lot of different animals coming by.
Oh, how so?
Well, we'll be talking a lot about chickens. Trust me, you'll see.
Sounds exciting. We met up with 3 different scientists from 3 very different fields, to which we spoke about their recent research and how this fits in their discipline.
And that's how we'll go from topics ranging from AI and the field of computer science, all the way to agroecology and chemistry. But don't worry, we'll talk you through it.
We'll also talk about how these different fields still deal with the same risks and hurdles. That'll be episodes 5, 6 and 7, where we dive deeper into ethics, the relation of science and society, and finally open science.
So these 3 different fields we're talking about, are they really entirely different? Is there not some overlap between these 3 fields, or am I wrong? I mean, is there not some sort of important use of AI within agroecology or something like that?
Well, I think what is difficult with that is that computer science, of course, works with models and it needs something to compute and simulate. So it's, in a way different than the other 2 fields because it's more so about something. Mm-hmm. So, for example, with computer science, you take information from a field like chemistry or agroecology and you put it in a model and then you are able to simulate it. So in that sense, computer science works in a very different way, or what do you think?
No, but that does mean that computer science needs other disciplines in order to function, because otherwise there would be nothing to model.
Yeah. And how about other fields? Maybe agroecology?
Yeah, I think in agroecology, from what I know, they don't model as much, so maybe not as much with computer science. But I mean, agroecology needs chemistry because chemistry is the one that makes all the chemical substances. And while in agroecology they try to use a very limited amount of like artificial fertilizer, I mean, there's probably still substances that needs to be made using chemistry. So I think in that way, chemistry and agroecology are definitely linked.
Yeah. And maybe chemistry is also linked to computer science in the sense of maybe with certain computer models, you can predict how molecules can fold or how they function within a bigger system.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe you can figure out how certain molecules are, like how the molecules are built. So like what's the structure of different molecules that are made through certain, experiments.
Yeah, that's nice. But then the field itself, how does the research work? Because when you see chemistry or agroecology, they're quite experimental. Is this also the case with the computer sciences?
Yeah, I think here it's kind of the difference between empirical and non-empirical research.
Yeah, I agree. So then empirical in the sense of you base it on the stuff that you see, and non-empirical then being more so experimental or creational even, if you can use that word. So when you have non-empirical research, you make something out of, thin air, between air quotes, whereas empirical research is based on real-life data.
So non-empirical would be basically doing experiments in your head, so that there's not really anything.
I heard somebody say you can do non-empirical research in a closed closet. So if you put the door shut and you can still do the research, then it's non-empirical.
Ah, right. Clear. So yeah, when thinking about like this empirical, non-empirical research, I think agroecology and chemistry are both clearly empirical because like they use experiments and you have like answers coming from these experiments that we can then use. Well, I feel like with computing science, this might be more non-empirical, don't you think?
Yeah, I agree. It's based on models, but then still the models have to be based on something. So everything is interwoven and intertwined.
Yeah, wow. So in the end, all disciplines function very differently. They have a very different type of impact on the world around us. However, this does not mean that they operate completely separate from each other.
This is now only a short introduction of this podcast series. So in the next episode, we'll dive in a lot deeper. Do you feel prepared for that?
Yes, let's go. Go.
Hello, and welcome to Science In and Out. I am Eline.
And I'm Thijs, and we'll be your host for today.
And today's theme is...
PFAS.
Hey Thijs. So today's topic is PFAS, and I understand you have some personal experience with that.
Yes, or actually my parents have some personal experience with this because they have chickens at home, and PFAS turns up to be a little bit of a problem there. I asked them to explain last time I visited.
Well, yep, yep.
Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jan.
I'm Mieke.
I'm here because you guys have some chickens. And recently you've had some, problems maybe with the chicken eggs. What happened?
We didn't have any problem, but then in the news there was thought that PFAS also occurred in eggs from chickens like we have. So we would like to investigate it.
And how'd you go about investigating this?
We sent 10 eggs to a lab and they will find a lot of PFAS.
And what did the lab say about your eggs?
Well, the result came per email and they investigated for 20 types of PFAS and 2 of them were too high.
Since then, have you stopped eating the eggs? Have you changed anything else?
Yes, we eat less of them.
Eggs. And I'm afraid to give them to other people. Now, I'm also worried about the food from the kitchen garden. It's not sure where the PFAS come from the ground or from the worms or the food. That's not sure, so maybe there's also PFAS in the vegetables. And it's not sure how bad it is for your health. There are a lot of questions about PFAS, but maybe this podcast will solve them.
Well, we'll have our work cut out for us.
Yes, but luckily we're not tackling these questions alone. Joining us today, we have Clemens Meijer. He's an associate professor leading the Molecular Evolution Research Group at the Strating Institute for Chemistry here at the University of Groningen. Maybe we can start with a simple question. Did you have any eggs for breakfast this morning?
I do not have my egg in the morning, I have to say. I see where this is going, though. I'm not afraid to eat eggs as long as they're the right eggs.
What do you mean by right eggs exactly?
I guess you want me to talk about what happened to these eggs for free-range chickens. Yeah, it's an interesting story, I think. It's I mean, the RVIM has, of course, said that we should try to avoid this as much as possible, and the reason is that there are lots of colloquially referred as forever chemicals in there, or PFAS, pair and polyfluorinated alkylated substances. PFAS is like a group of tens of thousands of different chemicals, but the only thing they have in common is that they have many carbon-fluorine bonds. Overall, the concentration of these PFAS compounds is not high, but there are certain mechanisms where it can get concentrated. And so what apparently is happening, according to the RVIM, is that we have little worms that eat the ground, which has PFAS in it, and these somehow concentrate the PFAS compounds in themselves. And these worms are eaten by chicken, which then concentrate it further in the egg, and that's how you cannot eat eggs anymore, because the dose in there is very high.
Yeah, so talking about that, my parents have chickens at home with PFAS in the eggs, about 240% of the EU norm. So that is quite concentrated and quite bad.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering actually. Why is it bad to eat PFAS? What's wrong with that?
There is a difference between acute toxicity and what happens if you're long exposed to a compound that essentially is slightly toxic for you. So what happens is that over time, if you're more and more exposed to it, there are various theories of why it is actually not beneficial or unhealthy to have PFAS in your body, but I will go with one that makes sense for me. It looks a little bit like oil, so they can go into your cell membranes and they start messing with how viscous they are, they start messing with protein interactions. And this is, of course, a problem because we are having PFAS in everything, and it's constant exposure to small amounts of these compounds.
Yeah, you see this a lot, of course, in media. The public is quite concerned about it. What has research been doing?
I think there is a trend to phase out these compounds. I think it's a similar trend to highly chlorinated compounds, which used to be in fridges and ruin the ozone layer. So we successfully phased this out. It's a bit trickier because PFAS compounds have very specific properties which chemists, chemical engineers, material designers, and so on like. So, but there is a clear trend, especially in Europe, to reduce the amount and also make sure that PFAS are not allowed essentially anymore. So the European Union is currently evaluating a stop to all of these compounds, but that's also tricky because what is a PFAS if there are like tens of thousands of compounds, and do you write one legislation, tens of thousands of legislation? So that's a bit difficult. I think the other thing is what we're seeing now is that people actively think about how to remediate exposure to or like PFAS pollution, like how can we degrade these compounds eventually. There is lots of research in materials that can degrade it, chemical catalysts, anything which you would like. And I think the other part which is still a bit lacking is like actually detecting them. They are in very low concentration, so it's not trivial to actually detect them. And I think in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, there is currently a leading research institute which actually is able to measure the lowest level of PFAS, which actually can be used to assess the toxicity and the spread of PFAS.
So we're trying to use less of it. We're also trying to figure out how to detect it in the first place to really see how big the problem actually is. And then you mentioned breaking it down, and I believe that's also what your research is focused on, right?
Yes, so we had a very innocent thought. We strictly did not speak about PFAS initially. It was more like, ooh, carbon-fluorine bonds. So interesting, right? From a chemist, carbon-fluorine bonds are great. They are like the strongest single bonds there are in the world. And so it's really difficult to break carbon-fluorine bonds. And the trick is the more carbon-fluorine bonds you have, the harder they get to cleave. So they reinforce themselves. So that's one of the reasons why PFAS is so stable. And so we were getting really intrigued by this, can we play around and figure out a way of how we can actually use natural things to break something which per se is unnatural.
So you had this very abstract interest in breaking down these bonds that don't occur naturally. How did that turn into a study focused on PFAS?
A PhD student of mine gave actually a presentation about PFAS pollution because she lived in an affected area. And then she looked into biocatalytic methods to degrade PFAS. So this is the use of biological components or microorganisms to break them down. And after like 45 minutes of all the literature discussion that there is available, she was like, yeah, there's really nothing good. We need to do something against this. And I was like, yeah, sure, let's try to do something against it. So there is one compound in nature that is abundant, quote unquote, which has a carbon-fluorine bond. It's fluoroacetate. If you take like a little bit of fluoroacetate, you die. And it's because it's a metabolic poison. So you eat it, it goes into your body, and it basically tricks your body to stop making energy. And that's very interesting because it's mostly produced by plants. And they are trying to protect themselves from herbivores. Like, let's say a cow eats the plant, the cow dies or has a severe stomach ache, so the cow won't eat the plant anymore. That is basically what evolution is, and we are a molecular evolution lab, so this was an interesting angle. But of course, because evolution is an arms race between different species, bacteria in the stomach of the cow have learned to be like, if I'm useful to the cow, it will keep me around. So they have learned to degrade this poison, this fluoroacetate. And so they have come up with a protein catalyst, an enzyme, which can basically break the carbon-fluorine bond in fluoroacetate. Sure, fluoroacetate is very small, has only one carbon-fluorine bond, is far, far, far away from PFAS compounds, but it breaks this carbon-fluorine bonds about 30 times per second. That's faster than you can do anything. And that's incredibly interesting from a chemical point of view, because I just said they are so strong bonds. So we were like, if we could just harness a little bit of this enzymatic activity and convince it to work towards something which looks more like PFAS, then, if we do this step by step, we might actually get to a point where we can use these enzymes to degrade PFAS compounds. So that's the first part. So that's where our motivation or our inspiration came from. And then we're like, okay, so fluoroacetate, we don't really want to work with it in the lab. It's not like super nice, as you can kill yourself instantaneously with it. So we were like, let's look for something which is different, like fluoropropionate. This sounds all the same, but it basically is a bit longer. It looks a bit more like a PFAS compound. It has an extra carbon attached to it, so it's not a natural substrate or not what the enzyme typically uses. But we were like, that's good. It's non-toxic. Like, I mean, don't eat it, but it's safe to handle. And if this one is converted, if you break the carbon-fluorine bond there, you create a compound that is called lactate. Any of you is doing sports on a regular basis?
Yeah, sometimes lactate is the thing that makes your muscles hurt, right?
Precisely. So you're creating the thing that hurts the muscle, but it's something which bacteria can actually eat. So what you're doing is you convert something which has a carbon-fluorine bond into something bacteria can eat. And so if they eat it, they create energy, so they can grow and divide. So our strategy was very simple. We give enzymes, we give this fluoroacid dehalogenases, like 10,000 different variants. Each bacterium gets a single one of these. And then we feed fluoropropionate. And then they basically have to, if the enzyme they have is better, they will create more lactate, and so they will be able to grow faster and basically outcompete everybody else. This is actually a concept called directed evolution. So we are directing the evolutionary algorithm towards a function that we are interested in.
All right, well, it's nice to hear how this research came to be. And it sounds like you combined multiple disciplines into your research as well, which is interesting. Because, of course, we read your paper and it seemed like you used multiple methods as well from different disciplines. Could you maybe explain a bit more about this?
It's very simple. You take a gene, you put it into something which we are calling a plasmid, basically a fancy term for if it's inside the bacterium, it can make the enzyme. Then you heat the bacterium up to 42 degrees, or you electroporate or you electrocute them, one of those two things. So you basically try to just not kill them, and then they are very desperate, and they will take up things from the outside, like these plasmids. And then the bacteria, so we are enslaving the bacterium to actually make the enzyme for us. And then on top of this, we're torturing it with giving it zero food, apart from these fluorinated compounds we want it to degrade. So it's just torturing bacteria on a very high level.
And then you just look for the survival of the fittest.
That is indeed the survival of the fittest principle. Yes, it's a terrible social structure, but a very efficient algorithm to make anything better. Like I always say, evolution is an all-purpose problem solver. If you can find out a way to convince evolution to do what you want to do, it will make it better, better, and better, and better until your problem is solved.
So I'm just wondering, you were just talking about these bacteria and how they produce these enzymes, and then these enzymes will degrade the PFAS. But in the future, would it then mean that Thijs parents would have to sprinkle these bacteria over their chickens or over their eggs? Like, how would that work?
That would presumably land you in jail, but that is so. I mean, there are strict regulations of what is referred to as genetically modified organisms, right? We handle them in the lab, that's fine, but we cannot like start sprinkling them on your chicken, unfortunately. So how do we think this will work? I think there is a two-step problem to this. So I think in the Netherlands, especially around Groningen, we are very strong in water remediation. Institutes like WETSUS lead, of course, the way in this case. And I think there are strategies out there to concentrate PFAS compounds already from water or from the ground. But then you still have the issue that you have to degrade them somehow. And there's really no good strategy available. So what we are thinking is that we don't take the organisms, the GMOs, but we take the enzymes. Those ones we can take. They are perfectly happy. You have enzymes in your washing powder. That's no problem whatsoever. There's no danger there. And then we will give them to these concentrated samples and of PFAS, and then we will remediate on site at room temperature over a time the contamination. And I think over time you will then start seeing the PFAS level drop.
And you mentioned that in your research you used a chemical. What was it?
Fluoropropionate.
Yes, which is not quite a PFAS compound yet. How far away do you think you are from achieving a breakdown of an actual PFAS compound?
I think there is one problem we have to solve, and that relates with having two fluorines on one carbon. So I think we never saw anything which was active on difluoropropionate. And there are various theories out there. I've talked a lot about this, and researchers from different disciplines have different ideas of why this is the case. I don't really know, but I know evolution can fix it, because evolution can fix everything, so that's the goal. And I think once we start seeing activity on these compounds, or get enzymes that can degrade it, I think then it is a solved theoretical problem, then it is only an engineering problem. And I think with the selection in hand, I think we should have we should have the tools available to actually make it work.
So that's the final hurdle before you can start focusing on the more practical aspects?
I think recently somebody asked me what my time frame is, and I was like, give me a decade. I think then we are like, not me, like if I do it myself, it will be never done, but give the researchers who actually do the work a decade. I think the group will make it work.
So with this research, you kind of steer evolution to your own needs. Is that a thing your group does a lot?
To be honest, so once you are promoted to associate professor, you have to choose a title for your research group. And I thought molecular evolution sounded really great. I wasn't aware that everybody was asking me what it actually is. And I guess there are different answers to this. So for me, I think science has changed so much. Like it used to be that you are a chemist, right? And even if you look at a bacterium, you're like, no, that's nothing. I'm not going to do this. I think this has changed. Multidisciplinary research is so strong. And like for the research we do, it's essential that we have people who are chemists, molecular biologists, biotechnologists. So there are all kind of different fields coming together. So my dream is we are in the group doing a lot of this directed evolution on different topics. Drug discovery, enzymes that break down things, enzymes that synthesize things. And all of this is meant to using these type of selections where survival of the fittest is always the goal. So we are in the process of automating this whole procedure that basically the whole evolution is happening by itself, targeted to the gene, to the enzyme we are interested in, and speeding it up about 1 million-fold over what we would usually take. So what will take millions of years takes significantly less now. And so my dream is always when a PhD student starts, it's like, so if I had a choice, right? My goal is my dream is that you start your PhD, you go on holiday for 2 weeks while your bacteria evolve themselves, and then you spend 3.5 years or 4 years trying to figure out what the hell happened, because life is really complex and very difficult to understand, but it teaches you a lot of interesting things of how you can make things better in the end.
Okay. Thank you, Clemens, for telling us about your research. It was interesting to hear how you combine biology and chemistry to, well, hopefully one day solve my parents' PFAS problem.
Yes, and thank you at home for listening to Science in and Out. We hope you listen to our next podcast.
We're trying to get help from machine learning, not only to automate, but to solve a problem that we know human operators are having a hard time to solve.
Welcome to Science in and Out. I'm Marit.
And I am Anne.
And today we'll indulge ourselves in the zeros and ones, namely the field of computer science. We'll take you with us through the world of neural networks, AI, and mainly ask the question, what's the impact of this on our daily lives?
Yes, and also, what does our sewer system has to do with all of this? Today we are going to talk about a topic everybody has probably used already to summarize an article they didn't want to read completely.
Yes, I've been there. A lot of people are familiar with how AI may change the life around us majorly, but it's also kind of scary. What if it replaces us?
Another good way to look at it is how can we use it to resolve massive issues society is facing and use it to our benefit. For example, the effects of climate change.
Yeah, imagine your house getting flooded after a massive rain and the drainage system is overwhelmed. That's not fun.
That'll be awful. Yet, fear no longer, because our guest of today is very busy using machine learning to prevent all of this. So let's quickly dive in the world of sewage water with us. Not literally though.
To dive into this topic, we meet up with Professor Dilek Dustiger on a misty Monday morning in our little studio. Dilek is a professor at the University of Groningen in the field of AI and computer sciences and also teaches there. But how did you get into all of this?
From the beginning, the very beginning. The very beginning. I was studying in France. I was born and raised in France. Early enough in primary school, in my primary school, we had some programming courses, really into the logic of programming. I really liked it. Computer science specifically was a decision that I made in high school. And I think that was an age, where I was also asking myself a lot of questions about, the meaning of life. And I said, wow, that's exactly what I want to do in life. I was really intrigued by whether a piece of software, a robot or an AI can really be as smart as a human being, can reach the same level as a human being. Intrinsically, I had this belief that this is never going to be possible. Human being will always have something on top of what machine can do, and I decided I will go into computer science to prove to the world that this is not possible. That was like one of the initial motivation around when I was 18, 17 years old in high school.
So then, after studying computer sciences, Dilek became a researcher.
She has more than 15 papers on her name and met up to talk to us about her latest one.
Because, okay, what we talked about in the introduction, what does computer science have to do with sewage systems?
In countries like Netherlands, where we have a lot of rain, you may end up with an overflow. So it's a big problem. I mean, we all experience that, right? When you bike from home and then suddenly your bike lane is underwater, right? My research is basically about how to monitor this to start with, and how to have a good picture, a clear picture of what is the current status of this system, and also predict what will happen in the near future, and make decision on if there is a storm coming, some rain coming, how to do some control to make sure that the overflow does not happen.
This overflow that Dilek talks about is what happens when our sewage system is too full. For example, when it rains a lot or everyone would start showering at the exact same time. There is so much water in the system that it overflows. All the pipes lead to a water purification center, but the center can only hold so much water, and when it becomes too much, the center is forced to also lose some of the dirty water directly into nature. And this is bad. This water is full of every gross thing that we pour down the drain.
Safe to say that I would not like to be a fish near that purification center.
The wastewater system in many countries, especially today, for example, in Netherlands, is a critical system. The quality of life of many people depends on it, but also it's huge. It's a large system. It's a connected system because you have basically you're collecting it from all the households. So there are many pipes, junctions, and this wastewater is moved or transported to these purification centers. So it's a large, complex network system.
And is that what makes it so difficult? So there are many different measurement points that it almost becomes impossible for humans to predict what will happen without using a model.
If you do an abstraction, you can think of it as a graph, basically. And the problem being, especially in countries like Netherlands, is that it's not only transporting wastewater from households to the purification centers, but it's also open to collect stormwater.
But how do they do this now then?
Well, they use a similar model, but based on physics and calculations. The problem, however...
A physics-based simulation basically means that you are modeling the underlying physics, fluid dynamics, the way the flow of the water, etc., etc. And the disadvantage of this physics-based simulation is, just like you mentioned, it's extremely expensive. It's a model at the end of today, so there is a lot of uncertainty, and because of the uncertainty, they often need to do calibration. So the physics-based simulation estimate the level of water in the different nodes, but the water engineers, they know that, okay, what is estimated is probably, plus minus 20-30%. There is always a range of uncertainty they add on top.
To fix the problem that we have with a physics model that is too inaccurate and also expensive, Dilek created something called a digital twin.
This is sort of like The Sims, where you make a digital world that looks a lot like our own world, but because it's in the computer, you're able to change little things. A digital twin, however, is even more special.
Digital twin is like a digital representation of what is happening in the real world. Digital twin, they have two-way communication usually with the physical world. So there are data coming from the real world which is fed into the digital twin. And sometimes when you make decisions in your digital twin based on, what you want to control, you can also send data back to the physical world. But a digital twin is kind of like a simulation of your system, except that the simulation, you wouldn't have this communication, this two-way communication with the physical world. The artificial neural network is a very old machine learning model, and it's very good in learning patterns.
Okay, so how does this work? How do you teach something to a computer model?
Well, let's say, for example, you want the model to learn the difference between a cat and a dog. For us, it's not so difficult. You would think.
A cat is often smaller. It has a longer tail, a shorter nose, right? A dog has its tongue out of his mouth. I don't know. You just kind of see it, right?
Yeah, that's what you would think. Yeah, because you just see a difference and we can recognize what a cat looks like and what a dog looks like. But for a computer, this is not as simple. To be able to recognize this, it needs a lot of information or data input. If you show a computer thousands of pictures of a cat from a lot of different angles, at a certain point, the computer will be able to predict whether or not an image it has never seen before is a cat, a dog, or maybe even a chicken.
Now, the graph neural network goes one step further in the sense that, especially in systems like the wastewater systems or any graph-based system, because the underlying structure is a graph, there is a graph topology, and which means that what is happening in one node is affected by what is happening in the neighboring nodes as well.
A node is like a measurement point. So in this case, that would be sensors that measure how high the water is. But in this system, all of those nodes are connected to each other and know what's happening in their neighbors' measurements.
You also add the information of what is happening on the neighborhood, because if the water is high in the neighborhood, you probably know that it will be high in your where you are as well. Now, so we are really incrementally increasing the complexity of our graph neural network. So we started by adding, from neural network to graph neural network, we started by adding this topological information. You can also predict whether there will be rain coming. So you can then predict if an overflow will happen. And if this is the case, you could control your system, closing some of the pipes, derouting the water into other part of the system where the level is still below the max capacity.
Oh, does that mean humans aren't necessary anymore? And we can just throw away the model we're using right now?
I don't see these models replacing completely the existing physics-based simulations models, but I see them complementing each other. And I think it's always important to have a human operator sitting in front of the screen and monitoring also what is happening and making decisions or overriding maybe some decisions.
Wow, this sounds like there's no problems anymore.
We're forgetting about the sensors.
Oh, yeah.
Right now, you still have a lot of them, right? So they're giving data, but what was the problem with that again?
The sensors are extremely expensive, and the municipality doesn't have cannot afford to have deploy a full coverage of the wastewater system. We are about to 20-30% of coverage of the system. Are we able to estimate the level of the water in the remaining nodes with a good accuracy, which is acceptable, according to the standards of water engineers? The water engineer that we are collaborating with, they said, if your average error is within 20 to 50 centimeter, this would be acceptable, and I think we have reached this level.
So with very few but very expensive sensors, DILAG is still able to make predictions that are very accurate.
But that's fun and all, but can this also be used for other things?
The wastewater system is just an application field, and we abstract this system and it's just a graph for us. And the power is one of the strength of this method is that you can basically apply it to any system which can be abstracted as a graph. This could be the energy grid. This could be a transportation system. So it's really interesting in the sense that it can be applied to many different fields.
This new way of combining a GNN with a digital twin and using it for very accurate estimations can be very helpful then.
Well, first, related to this particular project, there is a problem existing nowadays because humans cannot solve this problem. So we're trying to get help from machine learning, not only to automate, but to solve a problem that we know human operators are having a hard time to solve. So in that particular problem, I don't see, the machine learning model replacing a human being. I see the machine learning model helping the human operator. And in my field, this is the way I use AI. This is the way I use machine learning. So in the type of problems that I tackle, for me, machine learning is always a tool, always a helper, and it all depends on how you use it. People say AI, I think this is ChatGPT. AI is a very broad term. AI could mean robotics, AI could be natural language processing, AI could mean different machine learning models, deep learning models. There are so many different things that, are covered by the very general term of AI. Nowadays, when we say AI, people just think of ChatGPT, LLM, and there is this kind of like a love-passion relationship, which like a love-hate relationship. So it's like either you use it, but you don't want to admit that you use it. You love it, but you hate it because you're afraid that it will replace it, etc. But yes, you're right. To break this misconception, it could be very interesting to talk about the different, very useful and impactful use of machine learning.
So, by using AI, we'll make the world a bit safer? That sounds really wonderful, actually.
Yes, through replicating our world in a digital one, we can learn more about what is happening in the world around us. We can be ahead of dangers and even prevent them, instead of always having to be reactive to them. Really? AI is way more than just ChatGPT making generic essays. By using machine learning, we can make ourselves a bit smarter and maybe even more efficient.
Yeah, because we want to make a difference and solve problems that affect all of us. And instead of fearing whether AI will replace us, we must utilize computer learning techniques and thereby change the world around us.
What about the antibiotics that are given to these animals? Are they found in the manure? Do they resist the process that the farmers are doing and then find them in the soil and we can find them in the vegetables?
Welcome everyone to this episode of Science In and Out. I am your host Wouter and I'm joined here today with Anouk.
Hi.
And today we're going to talk about the future of farming, agroecology. Currently, farming is unsustainable. The world population is growing and more people have a bigger demand for food. So we have to look into the problems that come with changes in farming. Right now there's problems with nitrogen. It's hard to have a sustainable footprint using current farming practices. And you can tell by just watching the news that farming is becoming a booming topic. Recently I've been watching Clarkson's Farm. And as we know, Jeremy Clarkson is a very big car enthusiast and doesn't care about the environment. But even he was talking about ecological farming. He introduced me to the subject of agroecology, so I looked into it. Agroecology is a sustainable way of farming that works with nature. It integrates both ecology and social principles to create a kind of farming that takes plants, animals, humans and the environment into account, together with social aspects. Agroecology is kind of a counterpart to intensive farming systems. It's an umbrella term and covers, for example, organic farming. Agroecology is important because our current food systems and way of farming are not sustainable. Agroecology can positively impact the climate, the environment, and work together with the growing population.
So this umbrella term you're talking about, actually one of the things that is included in agroecology is circular ecology or circular agriculture. And this is a way of farming in kind of a closed loop system where you optimize the use of resources and limit the amount of waste you produce. You could kind of see this as farming in a circle. So the waste, such as litter, is actually used as fuel for the crops, which are then eaten again by animals, which again produce litter. So this tries to use as few fossil fuels as possible and minimizes the loss of water and nutrients and kind of creates this full circle moment. Sadly, this type of farming is quite hard to implement with the current uses in farming. For example, because of the use of a kind of medicine in farming called antibiotics, it can actually become harder to treat infections in humans.
That antibiotic problem is something that scares me, so I've looked into it. Antibiotics are a type of medicine that is used to treat infections caused by microbes, so for example bacteria or fungi. And these germs can become insensitive or resistant to these antibiotics because they get applied to the pressure of antibiotics. Only the microbes that are resistant to antibiotics survive this selective pressure. Their DNA can develop changes or mutations that protect them from the antibiotics. If then, via circular agriculture, these microbes come into our food or into our system, it's possible that we are unable to treat these type of infections with the antibiotics that we use right now. Resistance to antibiotics is a growing problem, and with more and more germs becoming resistant, it is very important that we are careful with the use of antibiotics, also in farming. So, knowing that agroecology is the farming of the future, but problems like antimicrobial resistance that we just talked about still arise and still appear in nature, we've decided to talk to a postdoc who knows a lot about agroecology, Dr. Barbara Prack-McCormick, and you actually interviewed her, Anouk.
Yes, I did.
Barbara is Argentinian. She grew up in a family of farmers in Argentina. Halfway through her studies, she realized that many things that affect our health and how they could be prevented lay in our diet. And if things lay in our diet, they also lay in farming. That's why right now she's doing a postdoc in agriculture and can tell us a lot more about agroecology. So let's go back to circular agriculture. Barbara was researching the nutrients present in animal litter used for farming when she stumbled upon antibiotics in the manure. These antibiotics were used as growth promoters in animal farming. This sparked her interest in antibiotics in circular agriculture.
Alright, so let's listen to what Barbara told us about this.
Studies on antimicrobial resistance in humans in Argentina, it's very strong, like it's been there for many years. And for animals as well, there's many groups working on that, but then nobody was studying like the link, what happens in the environment when all of this manure then goes to the environment. And so the big farms were not using manure from intensive animals like this, but then the small farmers, which in Argentina, horticulture is done by family farmers. And so during one of the economic crises in Argentina, they saw this opportunity of using the poultry manure, so manure from chicken industry. And well, it has like lots of organic matter, and it also has lots of nutrients. So they started using it, and then we're like, whoa, this is magic. Because also it has some beneficial microbes, stimulates the plant growth. So suddenly, like all of the horticultural farmers were using this manure, which it's good. Like it's these nutrients, waste nutrients that are coming back to the soil, and it's good for the production. And it replaced part of the input of external fertilizers. But then we have these antibiotics that are given in the poultry industry. So then how is this resistant microorganisms from the gut going to the soils? Are they surviving and then they're getting to those soils? And then what about the antibiotics that are given to these animals? Are they found in the manure? And then do they resist the process that the farmers are doing? And then we can find them in the soil and we can find them in the vegetables.
So the next big thing in farming in Argentina was poultry manure. It gave a lot of yield, but nobody knew what would happen with the antibiotics given to the animals. So my fear was not for nothing. Barbara decided to study this in Argentina.
Yeah, she did. And I had no idea how you would test antibiotic resistance in the soil, so I asked her what the setup of her experiment was.
So then what we did was to collect manure from poultry farms that were providing the poultry litter to the horticultural farmers. So we had like some similar conditions, and then we did a composting of it, and then we kept it for 6 months. We set our field experiment. We had 27 plots, and we grow lettuce. We had control that was without any fertilizer, and then we had our plots with the poultry litter like composted as a source of nutrients. So we applied it to the soil, we mixed it, and then we put like the small plants of lettuce. Then we took care of them before they were ready for harvest. And when they were ready for harvest, we harvested part of it to measure the concentrations of antibiotics in the leaves of the lettuce that are ready for harvest. We also took samples from the soil. And we had as well the samples from the poultry litter before all the processing. So the poultry litter we received, and also the poultry litter we applied to the soil. There we tested the concentrations of the antibiotics, and then also some genes that are indicators for antimicrobial resistance to see as well if those were changing once we were applying this poultry litter to the soil.
Now that she has explained how she measured the antibiotic resistance in the lettuce and the soil, our listeners must be on the edge of their seat to find out what her findings are.
So, a shock for a lot of people was that we definitely found the antibiotic traced to the lettuce. So we found antibiotic in the poultry litter that we received, and then we tested it after all this composting, and it was still there. So what we saw, it's a family of antibiotics. It's called fluoroquinolones. And then there's many different antibiotics there. But something interesting about it is that there's at least one antibiotic that it's allowed in animals. But that antibiotic can be metabolized to one antibiotic that it's not allowed in animals, and it's only for humans. So what we found after the 6 months of composting is that we had the one that it's for humans. And then we applied this to the soil. We didn't find antibiotics in the soil. So there it can be because it's a very clayey soil and lots of organic matter. So the antibiotic that was available was likely absorbed by the plant, and then there was no available leftover in the soil. So it gets like binded to the soil, and then it's difficult to extract it. Then in the plant we found both the one for animals, but also the one for humans.
Barbara found that these antibiotics can be traced back to the lettuce. This means that if we eat these vegetables, the microbes we ingest are resistant to antibiotics. If we then happen to get infected by any of these microbes, the infection will be very hard to treat.
That sounds like a big problem to me. What can the farmers do about this?
In the context of the study, this was the first question from the horticultural farmers, like, what do we do now? And because it's not that they can do a process that will eliminate it all. The decisions and the changes have to push the animal industry to banning some of the antibiotics for animal production. And then in the case of the horticultural farmers, to start, trying to reduce at least the use of this type of resource, at least until there's better conditions of it. It's a very wicked problem because it depends on decisions that a lot of people, and in those conditions you cannot force them not to use it, because then they become super dependent on inorganic fertilizers, like the regular fertilizers, and then they don't have enough organic matter for their soils and they cannot afford them. It's a complex problem and it definitely needs lots of political intervention.
So to fix this problem, a lot has to happen. With circular agriculture, many parties are involved. Like Barbara said, a lot of politics are involved, which makes it hard to implement big changes.
talking about this wicked problem. It's not just about the nutrients, it's complex and it's a lot about the people. And well, it's a lot about the governance and how the decisions are taken in the area. So then if we give some privileges to the poultry farmers and we allow them to just grow their animals with all of this dependence on antibiotics, then we are affecting the horticultural part of it. So it's something that we have to work together. Every decision, it's affecting not just them, but also the consumers and the citizens that are living and consuming in that area. It's a complex situation from all the sustainable agriculture approaches. Agroecology is the one that not just considers the farm practices, but also the society, the people that are involved, taking into consideration the governance, the responsibilities, the knowledge, how you create the knowledge so that you're not just telling people what to do, but to design it with them and use their knowledge as well, because then it's more likely that they are going to apply what you find.
That sounds a lot like the constructivist model, in which scientific knowledge is shaped by social, cultural, and historical contexts, and is influenced by things such as power dynamics and societal values.
This means that many different parties are involved, and one of these groups is us, consumer, the people eating the food. So what can we do to change these practices and help in the transition to circular agriculture?
So all of our decisions affect wherever the food is produced. So if we choose to eat something or not eat something, it's going to affect the system that produces it and the soil where it's produced. So I would say we have a big say in it, and also as citizens to express what we want and what we don't want. So which is the city, the town, the country, the world we want to live in. So I would say yes, your plate, it's also a reflection of the fields. So if your plate is diverse, then the fields where it's produced need to be diverse as well. And diversity, it's what can fight most of these problems.
If we now start looking at the soil as a microbiome instead of just a pile of dirt, we can have healthier soil and fight problems like antimicrobial resistance in agriculture. Together with politics, but especially the public, we need to work on closing the circle and move toward circular agriculture, making farming more sustainable for the future.
So next time you're in a supermarket, think twice about what you're going to buy. Because even as a consumer, you influence what happens in the field of agroecology.
With that said, I want to thank you, Anouk, for joining us. I want to thank Barbara for her expertise. And I hope you, the listener, enjoyed listening to our episode and to the series Science in and Out. See you again next week.
Hello, welcome to Science in and Out. My name is Edine and I will be your host for this podcast. And today I'm sitting with
Michelle
and Anna.
And we will be talking about ethics. Okay, so today we will be talking about ethics in science, which is a pretty broad topic, and there's a lot to talk about depending on the field of science, which is why we will talk about the fields that have been discussed in the former episodes, but related to research integrity and the Code of Conduct. This Code of Conduct is a document which contains guidelines that scientists use to work ethically. The Netherlands has their own guidelines, as does the EU, and not all countries have a document like this. The Dutch document uses 5 main principles. And these are honesty, scrupulousness, transparency, independence, and responsibility.
Exactly, and if someone does not adhere to these principles, we talk about scientific misconduct.
We're going into the gradients of scientific practice, this first topic. Maybe we can start with good scientist, bad scientist as well. I encourage the listener to play along with good scientist, bad scientist. And the first statement will be, I do everything to get positive results. Good scientist or bad scientist?
Well, that depends.
Yes, one could say that there are gradients of scientific practice. So good practice, for example, would be, of course, that the code of conduct is followed. But the other extreme, misconduct, would be ignoring the code of conduct or even intentionally going against it. An example of this is that a scientist makes up his own data. When there is intentional scientific misconduct, this is often related to the honesty principle, simply because the scientist is dishonest about the data or sources, for example.
Yeah, and in the middle, there's a gray area because it could be that a scientist is sloppy. So, for example, they have limited time, or they're not careful about the data they publish, or they did not work carefully in the lab, for example.
Okay, but is there like any way of checking then whether the scientist is doing a good job?
Yeah, there actually is. So that is through the reproducibility principle. So if one researcher comes up with data, the other scientists can check whether this data is real. So they try out the exact same experiment, and if they do not find your data using the same method, this probably means that you did something wrong, either on purpose or by accident.
Okay, so maybe we can create a good scientist, bad scientist out of this again. The statement here is, my data is reproducible. Good scientist or bad scientist?
Well, so looking at what we discussed, you'd expect that to be a good scientist. And generally that is the case. However, within chemistry there is an example where non-reproducible data can still mean that you're a good scientist. Or maybe too good of a scientist. In chemistry, some people are simply better at working at the lab than others. For example, because they work cleaner or they measure more precisely. Now it can occur that someone who is very good at their job can make an experiment work while others cannot. In chemistry they call this magic hands. And the question is whether you can call an experiment reproducible if only a person with magic hands can make it work. After all, it is not that the experiment is not reproducible because the original scientists did a bad job. It is rather that their peers aren't as good as they are.
Okay, thank you for explaining, Anne. So we have these code of conduct principles for scientists, and often a good way to check whether these were adhered to is the reproducible principle, exceptions aside. So Michelle, maybe we can tune you in for the next good scientist, bad scientist. And the statement is, the agenda of a big industry determines what I will research rather than what is good for society or the environment. Good scientist or bad scientist?
Yeah, so this is clearly a case of a bad scientist. And when you look at the code of conduct, it relates to the responsibility principle and the independency principle. So I have a case that is related to agriculture, and it needs a bit of explanation. So the goal of agriculture is to increase food production because we have a growing population and we need to ensure that they have food. One way to do that is by protecting our crops, and that way we can increase both the quality and the quantity of food products. So to make sure that crops are protected, they use pesticides.
Okay, and is there anything wrong with this pesticide use?
So we know that these pesticides pollute the environment, so they pollute the soil and the water, and as a result we lose a lot of biodiversity. So for example, insect populations decline, and they're actually really important in the production of food because they control pests, among other things, and it means that you do not have to rely on pesticides as much. But pesticides do not only affect the environment, so humans can also be exposed to them. So for example, when you eat certain foods or when people work with pesticides in the field, and they've found links between the exposure of pesticides and several chronic diseases. In the episode on agriculture, we also talked about agroecology, and this is what Dr. Barbara Prague-McCormick told us about ethical issues within the field of agriculture.
So ethical problems happen in society and in food production and agriculture as well. Agroecology takes them into consideration and tries to solve them. So, for example, fairness, it's taking into consideration equity, dignity.
So agroecology tries to make food production more sustainable, for example, by limiting the amount of pesticides used. And as you can imagine, the agrochemical industry is not very amused by this idea because it would mean that their profit would go down and they might ultimately go extinct. So for this reason, they promote pesticides very aggressively, saying that we need it to feed the world population. They went against the proposed pesticide regulation law. the European Commission even withdrew their proposal afterwards. So what we see is that public funding of agroecological research is growing, but it's still less compared to the funding for industrial agriculture. So even though we know that pesticide use is not a sustainable practice, it is still being done.
Okay, so what we see is that it would actually be better for the environment and for the health of people to look more into agroecology. However, because of this huge pesticide lobby, that is not really being realized, right?
Yeah.
Okay, are they at least transparent about this?
Yeah, so they do disclose conflicts of interest, especially when they're legally obliged to do so. But scientists in the field have urged for more transparency, especially when the research is funded by chemical companies. So there's still a lot of room for improvement. But even though the pesticide regulation law was withdrawn, agroecology is a field that is still on the rise. So the future of agriculture does seem hopeful.
Right. I think we're all happy to hear that.
Yes,
at least,
definitely.
At least a positive end note. So having talked about transparency, responsibility, and independency, we can move into another example from computer science. Before we start, let's do a good scientist, bad scientist again. So then the statement this time would be, I fabricate data. Good scientist or bad scientist?
Well, fabricating is a bad thing, but within computer science there is an example that might look like fabrication, but it is not. In research, often data is used from people or other real-life data. Various issues arise when using real-life data, for example because it's too costly or privacy sensitive. For this reason, sometimes synthetic data extrapolated from real-life data is generated with the usage of artificial intelligence. This was done in the episode on wastewater management, where computer-based learning was used to generate reliable data. Using synthetic data does mean that you have to compromise on the scrupulousness principle. This states that the method is scientific and the researcher is precise in designing the method, but also in reporting the research. One could doubt whether this method is scrupulous, since no real data is being used. The conclusion based on this method might therefore be wrong, but this doesn't have to be the case if it is done correctly. Therefore, it is important that scientists are transparent about using this type of data.
Okay, so just to make sure that I get this straight. So you have this thing called fabricating data, which is bad practice. But within computer science, you use synthetic data, which to the outside eye might look like fabricating data, but it's not the same thing. And it's considered normal practice then, Anne?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So within different fields of science, some ethical issues overlap and some fields have their own unique challenges. So what we see, for example, is that the pharmaceutical industry have some similar issue as the problem in agriculture, where an industry decides what is researched. But the scrupulousness principle, which Anne just talked about, also relates to the magic hands problem. In the end, all the fields have to adhere to the code of conduct to ensure good practice. Well, thank you, Anne and Michelle, for explaining.
Of course.
My pleasure.
And thank you at home for listening.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of Science In and Out. I'm Marit, and I'm joined by
Anouk.
In this episode, we'll talk about public engagement. So let's jump right in. For this part, I went to Forum in Groningen to ask people what they think a scientist is.
I immediately think of like Einstein and Newton and people like that.
I have a picture in my head from a man
White
with
jacket?
a white jacket and then glasses on.
Yeah.
And I think a really smart guy.
Microscope.
Alright, so people still have quite a stereotypical view of scientists. But big alert, we're actually two scientists. And, well, you cannot see us, but we are not two white men with lab coats.
No, we're not. But people having this view does do something. It does show something. Because do people even have an accurate idea of what science is? And what all those scientists spend their days on? For example, do people know how many papers are published every day? Here are some guesses.
Oh, millions? No. Maybe 10,000.
Worldwide. It's a difficult question.
Maybe
Worldwide, around 1,000, maybe? More, I think more. I think maybe 10,000. Maybe 100,000. Yeah? 100,000, yeah.
The actual number is actually around 5,500 papers each day. So that's a crazy amount of information that's going into the world. But to be honest, when in my free time, I don't necessarily read scientific papers. I'm guessing others maybe also don't. So do people even read these findings? Do we see this back in society?
You being a scientist, do you have a feeling that you're involved in a general science? Or do you have a feeling that you know what science is doing?
No, not really. So I'm working in a very small scientific community, and I don't know what people in other disciplines are doing.
I know a bit, but there's so much more to know.
So if people don't really feel connected to science, it does kind of explain the budget cuts that the government is making in the Netherlands.
Yeah, because the public decides who is part of the government, and if the public doesn't care or doesn't feel connected to science, they won't vote for a party that wants to invest in science.
Okay, so we do need a healthy connection between science and society, and it's very important to have that because science influences what society does and society influences what science does a lot. And that's what we'll be discussing in this episode. Like, why is this so important and how do they influence each other so much?
One of the ways society can influence science is by guiding what science is working on at the moment. We asked people which topics they thought scientists should be working on.
Medicine.
The research like in healthcare seems like the most important to me because, well, you want to be as good as that as possible, like cure the most people.
So there's a strong focus on healthcare with the people we asked. And one way these people can have an influence on what science is doing is by voting for a government that funds the fields of their interest, or by personally supporting organizations, like for instance KWF, that fund research into healthcare. This really shows how everyday people can have an effect on what scientists are doing.
Yeah, and of course you shouldn't forget, a researcher is also part of society. And as being part of society, society shapes values, goals, expectations and beliefs of a researcher. Like a researcher is not like a blank person with no interest of their own. So let's say I'm really interested in climate change, then I'll try and do research on climate change. Then again, I can't do that without funding. So it is a very intricate interplay that we have.
Yes, that really shows the role of society and science, but it also links to how science can influence society. And I like that you mentioned climate change because that's a really good example of how science has influenced society and the decisions we make every day, both as individuals and in the policies that the government makes to reduce climate change.
And of course, there are way more examples like that. If you think about, for example, smoking. Companies are not allowed to advertise smoking anymore on the television because research showed us that it's not very healthy for us. And by limiting this advertising, smoking becomes less normal and visible in society. This can prevent people from starting to smoke, or in some cases help them stop smoking altogether.
Okay, so by using scientific knowledge in order to make policies and government decisions for our own health and safety, we're able to use science in society, in a sense, and, well, use science to figure out how to accomplish specific goals or side effects for, well, what do you say, smoking.
And this was a positive example of this impact of science on society. But there's also cases where research was done with the intention of benefiting society, but society then took these findings and used them for an entirely different purpose. For example, with the development of atomic bombs, researchers didn't look into nuclear fission with the intent of creating a bomb. Rather, they wanted to see what would happen during this reaction, and they found that it released a really big amount of energy. Society, and specifically the government at that time, noticed this discovery and asked the scientists to create an atomic bomb. And this was ultimately used to bomb Japan in the Second World War.
And that bombing had quite a catastrophic effect on society, specifically the Japanese. So it's a really good example where it shows that the intention of a scientist and society can be completely different. Science, in this case, gave the information and techniques needed for the making of the bomb, but it was the government that took this information and made the decision to order the development and use of the bomb.
Now, of course, most scientists don't want to use their work to harm society, and in most cases, they actually actively try to connect to society to work on problems that society cares about. In this podcast series, we've spoken to scientists of 3 disciplines and they gave us some interesting insights into the differences and interactions between science and society in their specific disciplines.
So the researcher that you interviewed, what did she say about how the public is involved in her research or what she needs back from the public?
So Barbara is a researcher in agroecology, and agroecology is a discipline that is, well, to be honest, it's really linked with the society. As in, agroecology, like their whole point is that they want to make farming more sustainable, and they have to do this together with the society. So they have a lot of contact with farmers and then talk with them about their practices and how these could become more greener and better for the environment and more circular. So they have a lot of conversation with farmers on how to do this. So it's really inherently linked to the society. So I think in this way, agroecology might be the discipline most connected to society out of the 3. But what do you think, Marit?
Well, it's interesting, I think, because what computing sciences does help with are a lot of societal issues. For example, Dilek is researching on how we are able to manage our wastewater. So this is really important for society. However, the way that she's using it by making things more efficient and cheaper is the other way around. So it's very useful for society, but it's also useful in the sense that when this science has been done, so when we put money into it first, then it will cost less money to do this well.
And so that's more about Dilek's research on like her own subject, but like computing sciences as a whole, for like a discipline, do you feel like there's also this connection to society?
Well, society, of course, at the moment is getting more and more digitalized, and we're using LLMs and ChatGPT for quite a bunch of different things. So AI is something that is becoming increasingly more incorporated in society. So I think computing science becomes more and more relevant to society. However, I think it's difficult to make society understand computing science. And this is also what Dilek says, is that she finds it very difficult to make people understand that computing science is way more, and AI is way more than only those large language models like ChatGPT. So maybe computing science is a bit misunderstood. But maybe this is also something that happens within chemistry, the third field, that it's a bit difficult for people to understand.
Yeah, exactly, because, well, it's very far from your bed, as you would say in Dutch. Yeah. It's not something that you can, if you're not like an expert in chemistry, it's kind of hard to like imagine what they're doing in the lab and what these findings mean for us. But I mean, for example, with the research of Professor Mayer, I mean, PFAS is a really big subject right nowadays. It's very important that we live a more greener life and are more conscious about what we're doing to the environment. And these kind of findings that he's able to break down pre-PFAS kind of substance is actually very hopeful for us.
Okay, so we see that in these fields of science, but also outside of it, there's a lot of interplay between science and society, where society makes the decision on what research gets funded, but science also affects society by making discoveries that can help society in many different ways.
So it's because of this constant interaction between science and society that it's very important that we have really good communication between science and society. Maintaining and strengthening this bridge will be for the benefit for us all. And in the end, that's all we want. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Science In and Out. And we'll hope you see you again in the next episode. Bye!
Welcome, you're listening to FSC Radio. My name is Thijs.
My name is Wouter.
And today our topic will not be a specific research or scientific discipline, but instead the more broader concept of open science.
With more and more science in the modern world and science becoming a more important topic in our lives, it's also important that science is open to everyone. However, while I'm a very big fan of science, I still do not know what open science specifically is.
Well, we asked this exact question to the researcher we interviewed in the episode about PFAS, Clemens Mayer, and he had quite an interesting answer.
In the past, it was very common that research articles are published in journals that do not provide the general public access unless you are paying to access this manuscript. If you, for example, look at reputable science journals like Nature or Science, if you would like to buy one of these articles, it's going to cost you around $50. Obviously, this hinders a lot of research, not only information of the public, but also researchers at institutions that do not have access to these research articles because they do not have the financial means to pay them or they don't want to pay them, to actually read up-to-date literature and see where the state of the art is. And this is, of course, problematic. And so a while back, this has started in an initiative which is Open Science, and it basically says that ideally every research article that is published should be publicly available free of charge for everybody out there on this planet who would want to read it. And we are working toward it. Like, we do research because we are writing research grants, especially from the European Union, for example. It is a must that we publish our research papers open access, that everybody can access them. Otherwise, we are not allowed to publish them, essentially.
Yeah, so as you can hear, Clemens focuses a lot on this concept of open access to papers, which I think is the most important thing everyone thinks of about open science. And apparently in Europe, this is now very much the norm and encouraged by universities.
In my interview, I talked to Barbara, which was not from Europe, she was from Argentina, and things went a lot different there.
There's a thing with open access in the Netherlands. The universities, they usually pay for an article to be published open access. So me as a researcher publishing from the University of Groningen, I have a list of some journals that I can send to that are going to be covered by the university, or otherwise I have money from the grants to pay for it, so that what we publish is open access. However, in countries from the global south, I would say, I don't like the term, but anyway, it's the most used one. Most of the times, your institution doesn't have the money to pay for the open access, and your grants are not high enough to pay 3,000 euros for open access. Many journals have the option where you don't publish it open access and then it's for free. So you publish it like that. But then your paper just gets lost because it belongs to the journal. The journal will ask money to read it, so then nobody reads it. And all of this like AIs, and so they don't recover it. And then now you cannot use it for grants. So we're losing all of this research.
Here we could hear that there's also some challenges in working with open access and open science. And another challenge that we heard about is from our last interview that we'll be looking back on, that interview with Dilek. Working in computer science, there's also the issue of open data. So you don't only want to publish your research open, but you would also want to publish the data that you used for that research.
I have to say that we are lucky with our industrial collaborators because the data that we are using is already available, publicly available. Therefore, it's not a problem for them to make this the model as well as the data open. But it's not always the case. Sometimes when you work, especially when you collaborate with industrials, they don't want to share their data, which we can understand. Of course, it's their business which is at key. So, but in our case, it will be open. Yes.
Open scientific knowledge is not the only pillar of open science. What's also important for open science is the open scientific infrastructure, for example. These are places where you can do measurements yourself or even do science yourself.
I happen to have some experience with this. I used to work for a place called the Methotheek, Dutch portmanteau of the words for measurement and library. And this is an initiative here in Groningen, backed partially by the university, that offers scientific instruments for the public to use at home. One of the very popular devices that we lend out to people, for example, is infrared cameras. People use those to check their isolation at home, to make sure that in the winter they don't lose a lot of heat to the outside. And I think these initiatives, especially backed by universities with proper scientific equipment, can really help make science also something that is attainable for people at home.
I also happen to know that you're a student of astronomy. My father happens to work at the local astronomy center, And he teaches a lot of people who do not study at the university, who do not study astronomy, about the stars and about the topic of astronomy. This is also a way to not only teach new people about science, but also to help them use the very expensive equipment that they have there and to make it accessible to everyone in our society.
Wow, so people can just go there and get some time to use the telescope to look at their, well, whatever they find interesting.
Yes, exactly.
It's lovely to hear that, at least here in the Netherlands, there's a lot of opportunities for people to do these kind of personal science projects. Another pillar of open science is open engagement of societal actors, and this focuses not on giving people access to do their personal projects, but to really invite them in the process of science from institutes and have them contribute there as well.
One of the most common uses of engagement of societal actors is, of course, surveys of the public. One of the more famous surveys throughout all of science, but especially in the Netherlands, in Groningen, was the big public survey by Wiersma and Heijmans, two very famous psychologists. And this was so successful, these responses and these findings, they are still used by psychologists in their research.
I also think it's interesting that nowadays you hear a lot about AI models, but I think what's important to remember is that sometimes these AI models are actually backed by, well, sort of surveys and public engagement. There's this AI model in astronomy, it's called Galaxy Zoo, and it can look at an image of a galaxy and recognize certain traits and features about it automatically. But this model was trained by a lot of volunteers online. So there used to be this website where people could go to voluntarily and look at a picture of a galaxy and then answer a couple simple questions. And they did this with hundreds, even thousands of galaxies. And this is what trained the AI model. So that's now a very valuable resource. It's very important. And it was trained by just a lot of people in their free time doing this for fun.
It shows how we need these people to conduct research, but also to get these mass amounts of people to work together on science. Another example is, for my field of biology, the Dutch bird count, which every year people go into their garden to count their birds. And these numbers, these findings can always be used to look at how many birds are here, where do they go, where do they fly, are they doing well? And it's only possible because the people do this every year.
Yeah, I love this one. In our previous episode, you heard a bit of my parents, and I used to always do this with my dad, the Dutch bird count. We would sit by the window for a couple hours in the weekend to count which bird we saw with a little booklet to recognize them. Also just a very fun family activity for us. Then our last pillar of open science, open dialogue with other knowledge systems. So what are these other knowledge systems specifically? I think you had a nice example of this.
Yeah, there's some societies that we never get into contact with. So, for example, for my thesis, I looked into food systems and how people eat throughout the day. And we look at a lot of modern food systems and especially European studies. But then my supervisor advised me to look into the more weird food systems. So, for example, indigenous people or people that we normally never talk to. And there's a lot of interesting research about these people that normally never get into contact with modern European or American society.
I think this pillar also talks about just asking the broader public or the local communities to inform what your science should be about. And a great example that Clemens mentioned in our interview is that a PhD student of his actually presented the problem of PFAS, and from her local community was inspired to research a solution to that problem.
A PhD student of mine gave actually a presentation about PFAS pollution because she lived in an affected area. And after like 45 minutes of all the literature discussion that there is available, she was like, yeah, there's really nothing good. We need to do something against this. And I was like, yeah, sure, let's try to do something against it.
Okay, so then it became your problem as well. This is where the sort of motivation started.
You underestimate if like a PhD student, you spent with them, she was in her last year, we worked together for 3.5 years, and she's like, you really need to do something against this. You don't want to disappoint them, right? So you really would like to do something.
I think this shows how we have a very narrow tunnel vision sometimes in science, but sometimes the greater insights can come from very unexpected factors. So now that we've covered not only all the disciplines that have been talked about in the previous podcast, but also all the pillars of open science, it's good to look back at this whole project and to look into open science with a final conclusion. If we look at, for example, my podcast with Barbara about agroecology, you see that it's very discipline related, that open science differs through disciplines. So agroecology, for example, of course, has a lot to do with the farmers and a lot to do with money. A scientist can find something and decide that something has to be done. Farmer has to spend the money. And that's where this open science is important, because this dialogue with the farmers, not only with the rich big farmers in the Netherlands, for example, but also with the poor farmers in Argentina or in the global south that we've talked about in this episode, they all need to be in this dialogue, and that's where open science comes in.
I think another aspect of open science is looking for opportunities. So, for example, in the interview we did with Clemens, because he's in biochemistry, they had an opportunity to tackle the PFAS problem, which is an issue that is very present in society in the Netherlands at the moment. But not every discipline has a chance to be informed by society in that way. So when you do have the chance, it's important to take it. I think another way of looking at these opportunities is looking when you can engage with the public. So for example, the Galaxy Zoo example I mentioned, or the counting birds at home with your family. Those are lovely initiatives, but of course, again, it depends on what discipline you're in. If you're able to do one of these things, sometimes you're not able to involve the public. So it's important to keep an eye out for those opportunities, so when they arise, you can make use of them.
Yeah, I can imagine it's harder to use the public in, for example, biochemistry.
Yeah, I think there being informed by people is a good idea. People care a lot about biology, ecology, medicine, but I don't know if you would want a group of people from the public helping you out in the lab. That might not be the best solution. It really goes to show with all of these examples that open science goes beyond just free access to scientific papers, which is of course still very important, but also these other aspects, access to infrastructure like the measurement devices we talked about, or asking like a broader public to engage in a survey, or asking them to inform what your science should be about. All of these are factors of open science. And I hope that with that, you, our listeners, have learned a bit more about open science. We'll be back with another episode of FSC Radio soon, so we hope to see you then. Welcome to this last episode of the podcast series Science In and Out. We're your hosts, Thijs,
Michelle,
and Sandra.
In this last episode, we'll take a look back at the whole series and the importance of our role as science communicators. In the first episode, we talked to 3 scientists from different disciplines and asked them about their work. We talked to Clemens Meijer about PFAS, Dilek Dustiger about water waste management, and to Barbara Prock-McCormick about agroecology. So in those first episodes, we talked to these scientists about these topics. And one thing we wanted to achieve with these episodes is to highlight some of the science that's being done that maybe usually doesn't get the spotlight, but is still very important to our society.
Exactly, and I think especially with the field of biochemistry and what Clemens was doing is a prime example of this, because biochemistry in itself can be quite complicated. Most people probably don't understand what's going on, but by using a medium like this, like a podcast, you can easily communicate what's going on and what research is being done, because what he's researching is very important for society. He's trying to find something that can break down the buildup of PFAS in our environment. So communicating about this research, whether in a podcast or otherwise, is really important to show the importance of it.
Yes, and of course, communication isn't only important after the research has been done. So, for instance, Barbara told us that agroecology is a transdisciplinary field that doesn't just do research related to agriculture, but it also includes, for example, the farmers and consumers, as well as the government. So it includes different parties that all need to work together to make the research happen. And that makes science communication very important.
And from Dilek, we learned about the complex AI models that manage our wastewater. With the rapid development of AI, people have a lot of concern about this field and why it's popping up everywhere. And hopefully that episode has managed to explain a bit how and why AI is used when it comes to wastewater management. Then, after the discipline-related episodes, we had some special episodes related to open science, ethics, and public engagement. Michelle, you were on the episode on ethics. What did you learn?
Yeah, so in our episode about ethics, we can see that every field has examples of ethically questionable practices. But what appears questionable in one field might be more acceptable in another. And communicating about the ethical guidelines within fields, both between fields of science and society, is very important to create a better understanding of why certain scientists conduct their research in the way they do.
Yeah, and this importance of communication about how researchers conduct their research was also shown in our episode about science and society, because the people that we interviewed told us that they felt there was a certain distance between science and society. They didn't always know what was going on, what research was being done. And a way to bridge this gap could be open science, which is what the next episode was all about.
Yes, so in our episode about open science, Wouter and I went by all the different pillars of open science and how important it is to involve society in both practicing science and also giving people resources they could use to do science at home. So with that, we come to the end of our podcast series. If you listen to this entire series, I hope you learned something new about the science being done here at De Rug. And we hope to see you next year again when a new group of people will be making a new series of FSC Radio Science In and Out. Thank you for listening.